All right, let's dive into this game design deep dive, shall we? Looks like you've sent over a ton of material.
Yeah,
Excerpts from a textbook, some design frameworks, even some examples from games.
sounds good.
Today, we're going to try to break down the core principles of game design, maybe even spark some creative ideas for you along the way.
Sounds like fun. Before we can design a game, we have to figure out, like, what even is a game?
Yeah, that's what I noticed going through these materials too. Um, it seems like everybody has their own interpretation.
Right. It's tricky to define,
Yeah,
almost like trying to define art.
yeah, I see that.
Everybody knows it when they see it, but to actually pin down a definition is hard.
So what kind of definitions are we talking about?
Well, we've got philosophers like Bernard Suits, who see games as a way of overcoming unnecessary obstacles.
Okay.
Almost like we're choosing to make things difficult for ourselves just for the fun of it.
Okay, so like running a marathon when you could just drive there.
Ro-
Okay, so it's about choosing challenges. What else?
Well, and then there's Sid Meier, the mastermind behind Civilization,
Oh, yeah.
and he keeps it simple. A series of interesting decisions.
Okay, so it's not just challenge then, but meaningful choices.
That's it.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
affect the outcome. And then you've got designers like Tracy Fullerton who emphasize the structure of games, talking about a closed, formal system, rules and conflict, winners and losers.
Right.
And it's that kind of combination of freedom and constraint that makes games so compelling.
So we've got challenge, we've got choices, we've got structure.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Jesse Schell, another game design guru, he brings up this idea of a playful attitude.
Oh, okay.
It's not enough to just have rules and challenges. You need to approach them with a sense of fun and experimentation.
Right. It can't be too serious.
Okay.
So I'm seeing some common threads here, even though all these definitions are a bit different.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if we look at Keith Bergen's definition, he kind of brings it all together. He talks about ambiguous, endogenously meaningful decisions. So what that means is that the player's choices have a real impact on the game world, and there's often more than one right way to play.
Oh, okay. So it's not just following a set path. It's more open-ended.
Right. As a designer, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay. So it sounds like there's not just one right answer to like what makes a game a game. But understanding these different perspectives is kind of key to designing something compelling.
Absolutely. By looking at all these angles, we can create games that are engaging, challenging, meaningful, and most importantly, fun.
Now, speaking of creating these compelling experiences, you sent over some pretty hefty design frameworks.
Yeah, I did.
I'm talking MBA, FDD, the elemental tetrad.
The frameworks.
Yeah.
Like different lenses through which we can view and analyze games. Each one sort of highlights specific aspects of the design process.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Where do you even start with all of that?
You're right. It can be overwhelming. I think MDA mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics is a good starting point. It's so widely used, by professional game designers.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Mechanics are the rules of the game, like the actions players can take, the resources they can manage.
So the mechanics are like the building blocks. What about the dynamics?
Well, dynamics is what happens when players start interacting with those mechanics. It's the emergent gameplay, the unpredictable stuff that arises from player choices, and the interplay of all those different game systems.
So it's not just about what the designer intends, but how players actually play.
Precisely. And then you've got aesthetics, which is all about the emotional responses evoked in the player.
Okay.
It's how the game looks, sounds, and feels.
So even a simple game like tic-tac-toe can have aesthetics.
Exactly.
The visual design of the board, the sound effects when you place an X or an O, and that feeling of tension as you try to win.
Yeah, and you can see how even small tweaks to the mechanics can change the dynamics and aesthetics of a game. One of your sources used a modified version of Snakes and Ladders.
To illustrate this, just by changing a few simple rules, the game goes from like a passive roll and move experience to something much more strategic,
Oh, interesting.
where players actually have agency and can influence the outcome.
Okay, I see. I'm starting to see how just understanding these frameworks can give me a new perspective on games I already know and love.
Right.
What about those other frameworks, like the FDD and the elemental tetrad?
Those are great too.
Yeah.
FDD, so that's formal, dramatic, and dynamic elements, focuses on the structure of the game, the narrative elements, and the player's emotional experience.
Yeah.
And then you've got the elemental tetrad, which looks at the interplay between mechanics, aesthetics, story, and technology.
So each one's kind of like a unique toolkit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And for a deep dive here, we're going to zero in on one particular framework that I think will be helpful.
Okay.
It's called the layered tetrad.
The layered tetrad. Sounds like we're about to peel back some serious layers here. We are. Think of it this way. The layered tetrad breaks game design down into 4 interconnected layers. So you've got the inscribed layer, the dynamic layer, the cultural layer, and the player experience layer.
Okay, I'm following so far. What's special about the layered tetrad?
Well, what's cool is that it acknowledges that game design isn't just about the mechanics and rules that you create, but also about how players interact with those elements, the cultural context surrounding the game, and ultimately the experience that players have.
So it's more holistic.
Right.
Takes everything into account.
Exactly. And by understanding each of these layers, you can create games that not only are well-designed, but also resonate with players on a much deeper level.
Okay, I'm ready to unpack these layers. Where do we start?
Let's start with the inscribed layer. Think of this as the foundation of your game, where you lay down the rules, define those core mechanics, and establish the aesthetic direction. It's like the blueprint before you start building an actual house.
So this is where I figure out, like, the basic what of the game. What can players do? What are the goals? What's the world like?
Exactly. And the inscribed layer has 4 key components: mechanics, aesthetics, technology, and narrative.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Mechanics, aesthetics. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, a little bit of overlap.
Are we back to MDA?
You're right, but the layered tetrad gives those concepts a slightly different context.
Yeah.
Remember, we're looking at these elements specifically within the inscribed layer, that foundational layer of the game.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah.
So let's break down these components. Within the inscribed layer, what do mechanics encompass?
Think of mechanics as the nuts and bolts of your game. They're the rules, the procedures, the systems that govern how everything works. You know, they define things like player actions, resources, objectives, boundaries. So, for example, in a platformer game, the mechanics would include things like jumping, running, collecting coins, avoiding obstacles.
Okay, so it's not just what the player does,
Yeah.
but also the limitations and constraints within the game world.
Exactly. The mechanics create that framework for player interaction, and define the possibilities within that game world. Take a classic game like Legend of Zelda, for example. The mechanics of keys and locked doors create a really simple but effective system for exploration and progression.
Okay, I see how mechanics shape the player experience. What about aesthetics? How do they fit in?
Well, aesthetics are all about creating that sensory experience for the player.
Okay.
It's how the game looks, sounds, and feels. This includes things like the visual style, the music, the sound effects, even the tactile feedback of controllers, if you think about it.
So it's about atmosphere. You're trying to evoke emotions in the player.
Exactly. Aesthetics are a really powerful tool for immersing players in the game world and enhancing their emotional connection to the whole experience. And remember, even something as simple as a board game has aesthetics.
Oh, yeah.
The materials used, the design of the board, the tactile feel of the pieces, all those things contribute to the overall experience.
It's making me think about how even like small aesthetic choices can have a big impact on how the game is perceived.
Totally. A well-chosen color palette, a haunting melody, a satisfying sound effect when you achieve a goal, all these things can contribute to a much more engaging and memorable experience.
All right, so we've got mechanics, aesthetics. What about technology? I'm guessing this is where things get a little bit more technical.
You're right. Technology plays a crucial role in game design, even though it's often behind the scenes.
Okay.
This encompasses the underlying technology that makes the game work. Things like programming languages, game engines, hardware platforms, even the physical components of a board game, if you think about it.
So for a video game, we're talking about the code that makes it run, the engine that powers the graphics, the console or PC that it's played on.
Exactly. And even for a board game, the materials used for the board and the pieces, the way the components are manufactured, even the size and shape of the box, all those can be considered part of the technology component of the inscribed layer.
It's interesting to think about how technology influences both the design possibilities and the limitations of a game. Like, a game design for a powerful PC is going to have very different capabilities from a game design for a phone, for example.
Precisely. And choosing the right technology for your game is a really crucial decision that can impact everything from the gameplay to the development costs, the potential audience reach.
Okay, I'm getting a much clearer understanding now of how technology fits into the big picture of game design. What about narrative?
Narrative. This is where we delve into the story, the setting, the characters, the overall theme of your game. It's about creating a world that players connect with and a story that kind of unfolds through gameplay.
So we're talking about the plot, the dialogue, the lore, all that stuff that gives context and meaning to the player's actions.
Exactly. And it's important to note that narrative can be expressed in many different ways. Some games have a very explicit narrative, with cutscenes, dialogue trees, a predetermined story arc. Other games have more of an emergent narrative, where the story unfolds organically through player choices and interactions with the game world.
Like Minecraft, where there's no set storyline. Players create their own stories through their actions and creations.
Precisely. And your sources even differentiate between embedded narratives, those explicitly written into the game, and emergent narratives that arise from gameplay.
So even in a game with a strong storyline, players can still create their own unique experiences through the emergent gameplay.
Exactly. And that's what makes game narratives so fascinating.
Yeah.
They can be both authored and co-created, offering a really unique blend of storytelling and player agency.
Right, so we've unpacked the 4 components of that inscribed layer: mechanics, aesthetics, technology, and narrative. I'm starting to see how these elements work together to create that foundation of a game.
And remember, this is just the beginning. We've only just started to explore the layered tetrad. We still have the dynamic layer, the cultural layer, and the player experience layer to get a truly comprehensive view of game design.
Well, I'm hooked already. I can't wait to delve into those other layers and see how they build upon this foundation we've established.
All right, so we've laid the foundation with that inscribed layer, the blueprint of our game. But a blueprint is just a static representation, right?
Yeah.
To really understand a game, we need to see it in action.
Okay.
That's where the dynamic layer comes in.
So if the inscribed layer is the blueprint, the dynamic layer is like watching the construction crew bring that blueprint to life.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Seeing the building take shape.
The dynamic layer is the game in motion. It's where players actually interact with the mechanics, the aesthetics, the technology, and the narrative that we defined in that inscribed layer.
So it's less about what WE as designers intend and more about how players actually engage with the game.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, because the dynamic layer is all about emergent gameplay. It's those unexpected moments, those clever strategies, those surprising outcomes that arise from the interplay between players and the game systems.
I'm starting to see how this connects back to that idea of meaningful decisions we talked about earlier.
Right.
It's not just about choosing A or B, but about understanding how those choices ripple through the game and create unique experiences for each player.
You're spot on. And your sources actually provide some really great examples of emergent gameplay. Remember that discussion about players exploiting dungeon designs in Legend of Zelda?
Oh, yeah.
To sequence break and reach areas they weren't supposed to access? That's a classic example of emergent gameplay,
Right.
arising from the interaction between players and the game's mechanics.
Right. The designers may not have intended for players to be able to do that, but it creates a whole new layer of challenge and excitement for those who discover those exploits.
And it's not always about glitches or exploits either. Think about a game with a hookshot mechanic.
Okay.
The designers might have intended it primarily for traversal, but players will inevitably find creative ways to use it for combat, for puzzle solving, even speedrunning.
Ah, so the dynamic layer is where those aha moments happen.
Right.
It's like a conversation between the designer and the player,
Yeah.
where the player's discovering possibilities that even the designer might not have anticipated.
Exactly. And those aha moments, those are often what make games so engaging and rewarding. It's that feeling of discovery, of mastery, of pushing the boundaries of what's possible within that game world.
It's like the game becomes a collaborative creation between the designer and the player at that point. Okay, so we've got the inscribed layer, the blueprint. We've got the dynamic layer where the game comes to life through player interaction. What's next?
Now we shift our focus to the cultural layer. And this layer recognizes that games don't exist in a vacuum. They're influenced by the culture in which they're created and played, and they, in turn, can influence culture.
So we're talking about the bigger picture here. How do societal norms, values, even current events shape the games we play? And how do those games then shape society?
Precisely. Think about how different genres of games have evolved over time,
Right.
reflecting changes in technology, social attitudes, even political landscape.
Like how the rise of the internet led to this whole explosion of online multiplayer games.
Yeah.
Which created entirely new social spaces and communities.
Exactly. And the cultural layer also considers how games are interpreted and discussed.
Okay.
By players, by critics, by the media.
So that's like how certain games become cultural touchstones, spark conversations about important issues, or even influence things like fashion, music, art.
Exactly. And this layer also acknowledges that games can be a really powerful form of expression,
Okay.
reflecting the values and perspectives of both the designers and the players.
So games are more than just entertainment then. They can be a reflection of who we are and what we care about as a society.
Exactly. And by understanding that cultural layer, we can design games that are not only fun and engaging, but also meaningful and relevant to the world around us.
It makes me think about the responsibility we have as game designers.
Right.
We're not just creating entertainment.
Right.
We're shaping culture.
That's a really important point. Game design is a powerful craft, and it's so essential to be mindful of the potential impact our creations can have.
Okay, so we've gone from the blueprint of the inscribed layer to the dynamic interplay of the dynamic layer, and now to the broader cultural context of the cultural layer.
Right.
Where does that leave us? What's the final layer of the layered tetrad?
The final layer, and arguably the most important, is the player experience layer. This is where it all comes together. It's about understanding how all those other layers, inscribed, dynamic, cultural, combine to create a specific experience for the player.
Okay, so this is where we step into the shoes of the player and ask, what's it actually like to play this game?
Exactly. And this layer is all about understanding player motivation, emotion, engagement. What are the players feeling as they play? What are their goals, their motivations? Are they having fun?
It's like we're shifting from the designer's perspective to the player's perspective.
Yeah,
We're not just thinking about how the game works, but how it feels to play.
you got it. And one of the key takeaways from this layer is the importance of meaningful play. Every action a player takes should have consequences within that game world.
Right.
Otherwise, it just feels arbitrary.
It's that feeling when you're playing a game and your choices don't seem to matter, like you're just going through the motions.
And the source material dives into player intent, exploring different player motivations. Remember Bartle's player types?
Oh, yeah. Achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers.
Right. It's like a taxonomy of player personalities,
Yeah.
each with their own preferred play styles and motivations.
So understanding these different player types can be super valuable for designers, right?
Absolutely.
Because if you recognize that different players are looking for different things from a game, you can design experiences that cater to a much wider range of preferences.
Exactly. So if you're designing a game that appeals to explorers, for example, you might want to create a world that's rich in detail, with lots of secrets to uncover, hidden areas to discover.
And for socializers, maybe you focus on creating opportunities for collaboration, communication, community building.
Precisely.
It's making me realize that good game design is about more than just creating a set of rules and challenges. It's about understanding your audience and crafting an experience that really resonates with their specific desires and motivations.
Absolutely. And the player experience layer also takes into account those players who might try to disrupt the experience for others. The cheaters, the spoil sports.
Ugh, yeah, the folks who intentionally try to break the game or ruin the fun for everyone else.
Yeah.
It's like they're playing a completely different game.
It's a real challenge for designers to create systems that discourage those behaviors while still maintaining a fair and enjoyable experience for everybody else.
It's like trying to anticipate every possible way a player might interact with the game, both positive and negative.
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act, but it's essential for creating a positive and engaging player experience for the majority of players.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. We start with the inscribed layer, the blueprint of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Then we see how those elements come to life in the dynamic layer through that player interaction. Next, we consider the cultural layer, that broader context in which the game exists. And finally, we arrive at the player experience layer,
Yeah.
where we focus on how all of those factors combine to create a specific experience for the player.
You nailed it. The layered tetrad provides a really comprehensive framework for thinking about game design, from that initial concept all the way to the final player experience.
Okay, I think I've got a solid grasp of the layered tetrad now.
Great.
It's a lot to take in, but it's incredibly helpful for understanding the complexity of game design and how all these different elements interact with each other.
I'm glad to hear it. And now that we have a good foundation in those game design principles, I think we can start exploring some specific techniques you can use to bring your own ideas to life.
All right, I'm ready to get tactical.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's get tactical then. We've talked about the layered tetrad, that big picture framework. What are some specific techniques that can elevate a game from good to great?
One technique that I think is absolutely crucial, especially for, newer designers, is scoping.
Yeah, I remember that.
Being realistic about what you can actually achieve.
Yeah, the source material actually called overscoping like the #1 killer of amateur game projects.
It's true.
It's so easy to get carried away with these big, ambitious ideas. But if you try to do too much, you just end up with a half-baked mess.
It's true. Scoping is all about setting realistic goals, focusing on those core gameplay elements. It's like starting with a sketch before you attempt a full-blown masterpiece.
Right, right. So better to have a smaller, more polished game than a sprawling, unfinished project.
Hmm.
What other techniques should we keep in mind?
Well, another really important one is understanding structured conflict.
Okay.
Conflict is really the heart of most games, whether it's player versus environment, or even player versus themselves.
So conflict is what creates challenge then.
Exactly. It's what keeps players engaged.
Okay.
Coming back for more. Think about how even a simple puzzle game creates tension by presenting those obstacles to overcome. That feeling of satisfaction when you finally solve a tricky puzzle, that's the payoff of conflict.
And without conflict, a game can just feel kind of aimless, like there's no purpose.
Exactly. Now, conflict needs to be balanced with player guidance,
Okay.
which is all about helping players understand the rules, navigate that game world, feel a sense of progress without feeling lost or handheld.
So there are different approaches to that, right? Like you can have explicit tutorials or UI elements that tell the player exactly what to do.
Right.
Or you can use more subtle environmental cues, level design, to kind of nudge them in the right direction.
Yeah, one of your sources actually highlights a great example from Uncharted 3. The designers use lines and contrasts to very subtly guide the player's eye toward the next objective. You might not even consciously notice it, but it influences your actions.
With a gentle hand on your back, guiding you through without being too obvious about it.
Exactly. Good player guidance is all about finding that balance
Yeah.
between providing enough information to keep the player from getting frustrated, but also allowing them that freedom to explore and discover on their own.
Speaking of exploration and discovery, let's talk about puzzle design.
Yeah.
Puzzles can be such a fantastic way to engage players' minds and add a layer of depth to a game.
Absolutely. The source material actually outlines some really, really good goals for effective puzzle design.
Oh.
First and foremost, puzzles should be user-friendly. They shouldn't make the player feel stupid. The player should be able to grasp the basic mechanics of the puzzle very quickly and easily.
Right. Nothing kills the fun faster than a puzzle that just feels obtuse or unfair.
Exactly. Puzzles should also provide instant feedback,
Okay.
so the player knows whether they're on the right track or not. This keeps things engaging and prevents frustration.
Like those aha moments we talked about. You want the player to feel clever,
Exactly.
like they figured it out.
Good puzzle design often incorporates a sense of perpetual motion,
Okay.
meaning the player is constantly making progress even if they, hit a roadblock.
So it's not about getting stuck on one single step.
Right.
There are multiple avenues to explore, different ways to approach the problem.
Exactly. And of course, a well-designed puzzle needs a crystal clear goal. The player should understand what they need to achieve,
Yeah.
even if there are multiple ways to get there.
And speaking of multiple ways to get there, the source material also mentioned different difficulty levels for puzzles.
Right. This allows players to tailor the experience to their skill level, ensures that everyone can enjoy the challenge without feeling overwhelmed or bored.
So a well-designed puzzle can be enjoyed by both casual players and hardcore puzzle enthusiasts.
Exactly. And finally, a truly memorable puzzle, a truly great puzzle, should have something special about it, something unique that sets it apart from other puzzles.
It's like that secret sauce that makes it really stand out, linger in the player's mind.
Exactly. Whether it's a clever mechanic, a surprising twist, a connection to the game's narrative, that special something can really elevate a puzzle from, good to great.
All right, so we've talked about scoping, structured conflict, player guidance, and puzzle design.
Mm-hmm.
These are all great techniques for crafting really engaging gameplay.
Yeah.
What about the actual development process? How do we take all these ideas and actually turn them into a game?
That's where agile development comes in. Agile is a methodology that's become super popular in the game industry. It's all about breaking down projects into smaller, more manageable tasks. Emphasizing collaboration and iterating rapidly based on feedback.
So instead of trying to create a perfect game from the start,
Yeah.
Agile encourages you to kind of embrace experimentation, be adaptable.
Exactly. And this iterative approach is especially valuable for game development, where things rarely go exactly as planned.
Right.
By embracing change and being open to feedback, you can create a much more robust and engaging game.
And Agile ties in nicely with another technique, paper prototyping.
Oh, absolutely. Paper prototyping is a great way to test out your game mechanics, get that feedback early on in the development process. It's quick, it's inexpensive, it allows you to focus on those core gameplay elements without getting bogged down in the visuals or the audio.
So instead of spending hours coding some complex feature, you can just mock it up on paper real quick and see if it actually works.
Exactly. The source material even describes how you can test things like traversal mechanics using paper prototypes. Imagine testing a hookshot mechanic by just drawing a line on a piece of paper to represent the trajectory. It's very low tech, but it allows you to get a feel for how the mechanic might work in practice.
It's all about getting to the heart of the gameplay loop without getting distracted by, fancy graphics or sound effects.
Precisely. And once you've tested out those ideas with paper prototypes, then you can start building a digital prototype using a game engine, something like Unity.
Yeah, Unity seems to be the go-to engine these days for like everyone from indie developers to like big studios.
It's a super powerful tool and has so many features that really make game development more accessible. It handles a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Physics simulation, collision detection, rendering graphics.
So you can focus on the creative aspects of game design without needing like a PhD in computer science.
Exactly. And the source material even provides a pretty nice overview of Unity.
No, that's great.
Walks you through the basics of setting up a project, navigating the interface, even writing some simple scripts. It also emphasizes the importance of good coding practices,
Right, so important.
which is so essential for keeping your project organized.
Yeah, especially as it gets more complex.
Absolutely. Clean, efficient code is essential for any game development project. And Unity has a fantastic community, tons of resources online to help you learn the ropes.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started by grappling with the very definition of what a game, even IS. We've
Yeah.
explored that layered tetrad, all that complexity of game design. We've even pondered the philosophical implications of gameplay as art.
It has been a whirlwind tour of the world of games.
And we hope it's been valuable to you, whether you're an aspiring game designer, a seasoned player, or just someone who's curious about what makes games tick.
Exactly. Remember, games have the power to entertain, educate, challenge, inspire us.
So go out there and play, create, discover those endless possibilities of games. Until next time, happy gaming.